When I first got tear gassed, I was really scared.
It felt like you were in this cloud of smoke that just kept pressing down on you.
There was a lot of burning going on around my eyes.
One of the canisters exploded near me, and I started getting these heart palpitations.
Everything was dry, and my eyes were tearing up, and my throat felt like it was on fire.
I couldn't really see. I couldn't keep my eyes open for too long.
The burning and the confusion and everyone running in every direction and the police charging towards the crowd, I thought for a moment I might get trampled, and that was terrifying.
You can't think of anything rather than survival.
More than 100 years ago, tear gas was developed as a weapon to be used on the battlefield. It was designed to force soldiers out of trenches during World War I. But nowadays, tear gas is used by law enforcement against civilians across the globe. Images of clouds of smoke rising from behind protesters are so commonplace now that it's easy to forget that tear gas is toxic and can cause long-term health problems and even death if misused. So how did an instrument of chemical warfare go from the trenches to the streets? And why does a so-called non-lethal weapon sometimes prove fatal? Tear gas is actually not just one thing. In fact, it's not even a gas. It's a term used to describe any weapon that releases a chemical irritant into the air with the purpose of temporarily making people unable to function by causing irritation to the eyes, mouth, throat, lungs, and skin. There are two types of chemical weapons that fall into this category: gas canisters that spray liquid aerosol droplets into the air, or ones that spray powder into the air, which is commonly known as pepper spray.
Tear gas was designed to be both physically and psychologically traumatic.
That's Anna Feigenbaum. She recently wrote a book about the history of tear gas and its modern-day uses.
After we start to see a lot of footage of excessive use of these weapons, there's usually a surprise by the public, as if we've never seen it before. And yet there's a pattern throughout history of these things being used so excessively that it reaches a tipping point.
The first recorded use of tear gas occurred in 1914 during the Battle of the Frontiers. French troops fired tear gas grenades into German trenches, causing the soldiers to flee and expose themselves to enemy fire. And almost at once, countries on both sides began developing poisonous gases at a rapid pace.
So after the First World War ended, a lot of chemical development had occurred. So there was a lot of economic and scientific resource that had been put into the war, and people didn't want to lose that. They didn't want to lose all that investment. And so after the war ended, they tried to find all kinds of what they called peacetime uses for these wartime technologies. And one of those wartime technologies was tear gas.
And so one man named Amos Fries made it his personal mission to rebrand tear gas.
So General Amos Fries was one of these men who said the kinds of things that we hear Donald Trump say today. So he was really anti-immigrant, really anti-foreigner, quite racist, and unapologetically these things.
He didn't want to see America's chemical weapons program dismantled and looked to law enforcement as the market that could save it. Tear gas was marketed as an effective, ethical weapon that police could use for crowd control instead of using live ammunition.
Tear gas, properly used, is an invisible, dependable, and effective weapon for law and order.
So it was a giant ad campaign. It ran in the trade mags. They staged events to show what the product could do. And this ended up creating buzz around departments needing to have this modern form of chemical weaponry for policing.
By the end of the 1920s, police departments across the United States had tear gas as part of their arsenal. And at the same time, the US was manufacturing and selling tear gas to governments around the world. It became the weapon of choice for colonial powers looking to squash independence movements in territories abroad, and was used heavily against labor rights protesters during the Great Depression in the 1930s. And over the decades that followed, its use internationally only grew and profits soared. In response to the civil rights movement and anti-Vietnam War protests in the 1960s, police would weaponize tear gas and other new riot control technologies on a scale never seen before. On March 7, 1965, what's now known as Bloody Sunday, police shot 40 canisters of tear gas at peaceful marchers before brutally assaulting them. And in 1969, a National Guard helicopter sprayed excessive amounts of tear gas on anti-war protesters on the UC Berkeley campus, gassing demonstrators and students alike.
So because the National Guard had to be called in during the civil rights movements and protests of that era, we ended up in a situation where police said, we can't have that happen again. And so after that era, so in the late 1960s and especially in the early 1970s, we started to see more training and more investment go into tactical squads or riot control squads domestically.
The riotous mob is a dangerous adversary. The tear gas grenade is effective for mob control and other general use.
So there seems to be a trajectory in which tear gas is actually a weapon of the authorities, of the elite, to try and maintain a particular kind of vision of America as a country that is run by rich white people at often the suppression of everyone else.
Tear gas allows law enforcement to disperse crowds easily, and when used correctly, without much harm done. That's why, technically, it's considered a less lethal weapon. But a recent Amnesty International investigation found that there is a disturbing trend of widespread unlawful use of tear gas around the world.
What we uncovered on the map was 22 countries in which there were around 80 incidents of misuse of tear gas in crowd control, in policing events. It seems to be a global, worldwide problem where when tear gas is used, it is often misused.
Amnesty International documented police abusing tear gas in multiple ways. Firing into confined spaces, which can cause people to suffocate, firing directly at people, which can cause serious injury or death, using excessive amounts of tear gas, firing at peaceful protesters, and firing against groups who may be less able to flee the area or more susceptible to its effects, such as children, older people, or people with disabilities.
This really isn't an instance of, oh, it's that country's police force. You know, we know that they're not well trained and they're not well resourced, so they're just using tear gas willy-nilly. It really is tear gas use in all countries.
A video clip from a recent protest against police brutality in Philadelphia went viral after peaceful protesters were tear gassed by police and then were forced onto a highway embankment.
We were attacked with rubber bullets, tear gas, and pepper spray. We were trapped in a small area that was impossible to get out without climbing a 14-foot wall. It was really scary. I saw a lot of people get really hurt.
When tear gas is used on people that don't have a clear escape route, it becomes incredibly dangerous. So what we saw in the clip from Philadelphia, we've got the problem that the gas is being contained in a small area, so its dose is higher. We have the problem that people are panicking, which makes it harder to endure being tear gassed. It makes it harder to breathe. And we have the risk of stampeding and people being crushed because there's nowhere for them to go and they're all running really quickly in the same direction.
In a statement, the commissioner for the Philadelphia Police Department defended the use of tear gas and said that it was used to safely diffuse a volatile and dangerous situation. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, prolonged exposure to tear gas can cause blindness, death due to chemical burns to the throat and lungs, and respiratory failure. Exposure to tear gas has also been linked to miscarriages. But despite the fact that tear gas has been around for over 100 years, we still don't know very much about how it affects people physically and psychologically. One study of US soldiers found that exposure to CS, the chemical used in tear gas, leads to a higher risk of them developing respiratory illnesses such as influenza, bronchitis, and pneumonia. In another study of 2 refugee camps in occupied Palestinian territories that are regularly exposed to tear gas by Israeli Defense Forces, residents reported conditions such as asthma, allergic dermatitis, headaches and neurological irritability, miscarriages, and blunt trauma from canister injuries. they also reported high levels of anxiety and depression. And part of the reason for the lack of studies on this is that we don't exactly know what's in tear gas to begin with.
There's very little transparency around what is contained within tear gas canisters. That lack of transparency impacts the research massively because we don't know what people are inhaling.
Despite governments and police continually claiming that tear gas is safe, there's no law requiring manufacturers to disclose what is in each canister or how potent it is. According to experts at the Omega Research Foundation, which researches the trade of less lethal weapons, there's no international regulation of their manufacturing or trade, meaning that companies around the world can modernize their products and sell them to whoever they want without much oversight.
So when we see these videos of excessive police violence, of course, we are going to blame the police for using that excessive amount of force. But behind that force is the training, the equipment, and the mentality. And all of that is actually an industry that I call the use of force industry that involves a lot of private companies, private people making a lot of money off of selling that ideology as the way that the police forces should work, and in fact must work in order to protect police lives.
So is all of this legal? Well, although international law bans the use of tear gas in war, an exception was made for law enforcement, allowing police forces to use so-called riot control agents, such as tear gas, against civilians for crowd control. There's also United Nations guidelines on how tear gas and other less lethal weapons should be used by police, but it's not legally binding.
So one of the things that makes it really difficult to have accountability around the excessive use of force for things like tear gas is that it is made to be ephemeral, to disappear. So it's much harder than something like a bullet or a video of a physical assault to figure out, where did it come from? Was the person's intention to fire too much of it or to fire it in an enclosed space? Those things become really difficult to gauge when we're talking about a gas that was designed to disappear.
Experts like Anna and Sam say that with greater transparency and regulation, tear gas can become the safer crowd control option that it's always been marketed to be. Thanks for watching. If you want to stay up to date on the latest breaking national and international news, be sure to subscribe to our channel, where we also dig into big issues around the world in our weekly series, Global News Explains.